They looked at his hoodie and saw a thug. They looked at his skin and saw a criminal. But what the crew of Prestige Airways Flight 909 didn't know was that the man they were dragging down the aisle wasn't just a passenger. He was the man who owned their debt. In a world where status is everything, Julian Vance was about to teach an entire airline a brutal lesson in humility. It took 3 security guards to throw him off the plane, but it only took Julian 60 seconds to make sure that plane never took off again. Stay tuned, because this isn't just a story about revenge. It's a masterclass in hostile takeovers. This is how one man destroyed a billion-dollar company before his luggage even hit the tarmac. The air inside the first-class cabin of Prestige Airways Flight 909 smelled of expensive leather, conditioned ozone, and the faint, sickly sweet scent of old money. It was a Boeing 777-300ER, the pride of the fleet, sitting at the gate at JFK Terminal 4, preparing for the overnight haul to London Heathrow. Julian Vance adjusted his noise-cancelling headphones and stared out the window at the rain-slicked tarmac. He didn't look like the typical clientele of Prestige Airways Royal Class. He was 34, black, and dressed in a charcoal cashmere hoodie that cost more than the flight attendant's monthly salary, though you wouldn't know it from the lack of logos. He wore distressed denim and limited edition sneakers that were currently tucked beneath the lie-flat seat of 1A. He was tired. It had been a grueling week of negotiations in Silicon Valley, closing a quiet deal that would ripple through the tech world in a few days. All he wanted was a glass of sparkling water, 6 hours of sleep, and silence. He wasn't going to get it. The disturbance began as a rhythmic clicking of high heels against the aisle floor, growing louder and sharper with every step. Julian didn't look up until a shadow fell across his tray table. "Excuse me, you're in my seat." The voice was icy, brittle, and accustomed to obedience. Julian slid his headphones down around his neck and looked up. Standing over him was a woman who looked like she had been manufactured in a factory that specialized in country club memberships and alimony checks. She was blonde, heavily accessorized with gold that clanked when she moved, and holding a boarding pass like it was a weapon. This was Felicity Vander Woodson, a socialite whose family name was plastered on half the library wings in the tri-state area. "I beg your pardon?" Julian asked, his voice calm, a deep baritone that usually commanded boardrooms. "I said." Felicity enunciated slowly as if speaking to a child or someone who didn't understand English. "You are in my seat. 1A. I always sit in 1A. Julian glanced at his own boarding pass resting on the console. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, ma'am. This is 1A, and this is my boarding pass." He tapped the paper politely. Felicity didn't even look at it. She scoffed, a short, sharp sound of disbelief. "Don't be ridiculous. There must be a system error. They upgrade people like you when there's extra space. But I am a Diamond Medallion member, and I specifically requested this bulkhead. Move." "I purchased this ticket in full," Julian said, his patience already thinning, but his expression remaining neutral. "I suggest you check your pass again. You might be in 1F. I am not in 1F. I am not a window gazer." She snapped. She snapped her fingers, not at Julian, but into the air. "Flight attendant, immediately!" A flight attendant named Sarah, whose smile looked painful and plastered on, rushed over. Sarah had been flying for 15 years and had seen it all, but she also knew who the Vander Woodsons were. They were high-yield customers. Prestige Airways instructed crew to treat them like royalty. "Is there a problem, Miss Vander Woodson?" Sarah asked, avoiding eye contact with Julian. "This gentleman," Felicity said, letting the word hang like an insult, "has stolen my seat. I want him moved. Ideally to the back, but I'll settle for him just being out of my sight." Sarah turned to Julian. Her demeanor shifted instantly from deferential to authoritative. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" Julian handed it to her. Sarah scanned it. It was valid. Julian Vance. Seat 1A. Paid in full. In fact, the code on the ticket indicated a VVIP status, a designation usually reserved for heads of state or owners. But Sarah, in her rush to appease the fuming socialite, missed the small print. "The ticket says 1A, Sarah admitted, her brow furrowing. "Well, it's wrong," Felicity shrieked, causing heads in the business class cabin behind them to turn. "He probably hacked it. Look at him. Does he look like he belongs in royal class? He's wearing a hoodie, for God's sake. I have a gala in London tomorrow, and I need my rest. I cannot sleep knowing he is right there." Sarah looked at Julian, then at Felicity. She made a calculation. On one hand, a quiet man in a hoodie. On the other, a woman whose father played golf with the airline's VP of operations. "Sir," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, patronizing whisper, "I think it would be best if we reaccommodated you. We have a lovely seat in premium economy. It has extra legroom. I can give you a voucher for the trouble." Julian laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. "You want me to downgrade from a seat I paid $12,000 for to accommodate her because she doesn't like my hoodie? No, it's not a request, sir. You are causing a disturbance." "I haven't moved," Julian pointed out. "I haven't raised my voice. She is the one screaming." "You are being non-compliant," Sarah said, utilizing the buzzword that airline crews use to justify almost anything. "If you don't move voluntarily, I will have to get the captain involved." "Get him," Julian said, putting his headphones back on. "Get whoever you want." 5 minutes later, the cockpit door opened. Captain Rick Sully Sullivan stepped out. He was a man of 50, with silver hair and a jawline that suggested he spent more time looking in the mirror than reading flight manuals. He walked with the heavy, swinging gait of a man who believed he was a sky god. He loomed over Julian. "Son," Captain Sullivan said. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask for Julian's side. He just saw a young black man in streetwear and a crying blonde woman in pearls. The narrative wrote itself in his mind. "We don't tolerate unruly behavior on my ship. You need to grab your bag and follow Sarah to row 24, or you're getting off." Julian paused his music. He looked at the captain's name tag. "Ah, Sullivan." "Captain Sullivan," Julian said, unbuckling his seatbelt but remaining seated. "I am asking you, for the record, to verify the passenger manifest. If you verify the manifest, you will see not only that I am in the correct seat, but that removing me is a violation of FAA regulations regarding ticketed passengers who pose no threat. Don't quote the FAA at me, son. I've been flying since before you were born," Sullivan spat. "I have a distraught passenger here who feels threatened by your aggressive demeanor." "My aggressive demeanor?" Julian raised an eyebrow. He hadn't stood up. He hadn't shouted. "I feel unsafe," Felicity interjected, seizing the opening. She clutched her Louis Vuitton bag to her chest. "He gave me a look, a threatening look." "That's it," Sullivan said. He grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Flight 909. Requesting law enforcement at the gate. We have a level 2 disturbance in first class. Passenger refusing crew instructions." The atmosphere in the cabin shifted from awkward to electric. Passengers in the surrounding seats had their phones out. A young tech bro in 2B was filming the whole thing, his camera focused tightly on Julian's calm face and Sullivan's reddening neck. "Sir," a voice came from behind. It was a passenger, a middle-aged man in a suit. "This is ridiculous. He hasn't done anything." "Stay out of this or you're off too," Sullivan barked, turning on the passenger. The cabin fell silent. Sullivan was drunk on power, and he was doubling down. Julian looked at his watch. It was a Patek Philippe Nautilus, platinum, worth more than the captain's pension, but the sleeve of his hoodie covered it. "Captain," Julian said softly, "I'm going to give you one chance to de-escalate this. You are making a mistake that will cost you your career. Check the manifest. Look at the name. I don't care what your name is, Sullivan sneered. You could be the President of the United States, and you'd still get off my plane if I said so. Now, are you walking, or are we dragging? 2 Port Authority officers and a TSA air marshal boarded the plane. They looked massive in the narrow aisle, their tactical vests bulky, their expressions bored but ready for violence. That's him, Felicity pointed, a triumphant smirk curling her lips. The aggressive one. The lead officer, a man named Officer Miller, leaned in. Sir, let's go. Don't make this hard. I paid for this seat, Julian said, his hands visible on his knees. I have broken no laws. I am being removed because of racial bias and entitlement. Sir, we aren't here to argue the law. The pilot wants you off. That means you're trespassing. Stand up. Julian took a deep breath. He knew how this went. If he resisted, he would be tased or beaten. If he shouted, he was the angry black man. He had to play the long game. Fine, Julian said. He stood up. He was tall, 6'2", towering over Felicity, who took a dramatic step back as if he were about to strike her. Get his bag, Sullivan ordered Sarah. Sarah reached under the seat and yanked out Julian's backpack. She tossed it onto the seat. I'll carry it, Julian said calmly. Hands where I can see them, Officer Miller shouted, grabbing Julian's wrist. I am complying, Julian said, his voice still. Do not touch me. Move! Miller shoved Julian forward. Julian stumbled slightly, catching himself on the edge of Felicity's seat. Don't touch my seat, she shrieked. Officer Miller grabbed Julian by the back of his hoodie and the upper arm. All right, that's it. Let's go. The walk of shame was designed to humiliate. That was the point. It wasn't just about removal, it was about asserting dominance. Officer Miller and his partner didn't just escort Julian. They manhandled him. They twisted his arm behind his back in a compliance hold that was unnecessary for a man who was walking voluntarily. They shoved him through the curtain, separating first class from business, and then from business into economy. Make way! Police activity! Miller shouted. Hundreds of eyes stared at Julian. Mothers pulled their children closer. Some people whispered, assuming he must be a terrorist or a drunk. But many others, the younger generation, the ones with their phones out, saw something else. They saw a calm man being brutalized by the system. As they passed row 15, Julian's sneaker caught on the carpet. He tripped. Instead of helping him, the officer shoved him harder. Julian's shoulder slammed into the overhead bin with a sickening thud. Stop it! You're hurting him, a woman in 22C screamed. Back down, ma'am, the marshal barked, pointing a finger in her face. Julian grimaced, pain shooting down his arm. He didn't fight back. He looked straight ahead, his eyes locking onto the camera lens of a teenager in the aisle seat filming him. Record everything, Julian whispered as he was shoved past. I got you, bro, the kid whispered back. They reached the aircraft door. The jet bridge air was cold. The officers shoved Julian out onto the metal platform, nearly throwing him to the ground. Sarah, the flight attendant, stood at the door, holding his backpack. She threw it onto the jet bridge floor. It slid, hitting Julian's foot. And don't bother trying to rebook, Captain Sullivan shouted from the cockpit doorway, his voice booming for the whole front cabin to hear. You're banned from Prestige Airways for life. For life, Julian repeated. He straightened his hoodie. He brushed the dust off his shoulder. The pain in his arm was throbbing, but the adrenaline was cold and sharp in his veins. He looked at Captain Sullivan. He looked at Sarah. He looked past them to where Felicity Vander Woodson was likely sipping her pre-flight champagne, celebrating her victory. You're right, Captain, Julian said, his voice eerily calm. I won't be flying Prestige, and neither will anyone else. Sullivan laughed and slammed the aircraft door shut. The lock engaged with a heavy metallic clank. Julian Vance stood on the jet bridge alone with the 3 officers. All right, let's go to the station. We're processing you for disorderly conduct, Officer Miller said, reaching for his handcuffs. No, Julian said. He reached into his pocket. Gun, Miller shouted, reaching for his holster. Phone, Julian corrected, pulling out a slim black satellite phone. Not a standard iPhone, but a secure, encrypted device used by high-level government contractors and billionaire financiers. Put the phone away, Miller warned. I am making one phone call, Julian said. You can arrest me after, but you're going to want to hear this. Something in Julian's tone, the absolute, unwavering authority, made Miller hesitate. He lowered his hand. Julian dialed a single speed dial number. He put the phone to his ear. It rang once. Yes, Mr. Vance, a voice answered instantly. It was crisp, British, and efficient. This was Alistair, his chief of operations. Alistair, Julian said, staring at the closed door of the plane. What is our current position in Prestige Airways? The officers exchanged confused glances. Position? We hold 12% of the voting stock through a shell company, sir. And more importantly, your private equity firm, Vance Capital, owns the leasing rights to their entire long-haul fleet. Specifically, the 777 debt covenants. The debt covenants, Julian repeated. Are they current? They are technically in arrears by 48 hours, sir, but we usually grant a grace period of 30 days as a professional courtesy. Revoke it, Julian said. There was a silence on the other end. A stunned, heavy silence. Sir? Revoke the grace period. Call the default. Initiate immediate asset repossession. I want every Boeing 777 leased by Vance Capital grounded. Immediately. Sir, that is the nuclear option. That will strand thousands. It will bankrupt the airline. They dragged me off Flight 909, Alistair. They assaulted me, and they did it to accommodate a socialite who didn't like my skin color. The silence on the line hardened into cold efficiency. Understood, sir. Initiating Order 66 on Prestige Airways. Repossession orders are being sent to the FAA and Eurocontrol now. One more thing, Julian said, watching the jet bridge retract as the plane began to push back. Flight 909. It's currently pushing back at JFK. I want that specific plane stopped. Now. On it. Julian hung up. He looked at Officer Miller. You might want to radio the tower, Julian said softly. Tell them they have a stolen aircraft on the tarmac. Officer Miller laughed. You're crazy. You're just a guy in a hoodie. Wait for it, Julian said. 60 seconds. Captain Rick Sullivan was feeling good. He adjusted the throttle quadrant, watching the tug vehicle push the massive Boeing 777 away from the gate. The rain had picked up, streaking across the windshield, blurring the runway lights of JFK into shimmering ribbons of red and white. He flicked the intercom switch. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Sullivan. We apologize for that brief delay. We had a security issue that has been resolved. We are now number 3 for departure. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the service. He released the switch and turned to his first officer, a younger man named David. That's how you handle problems, Dave. You cut the cancer out. David looked uneasy. Rick, the guy was pretty calm. Are you sure? I'm sure, Sullivan interrupted. Manifest is clear. Let's get this bird in the air. Sullivan reached for the radio to contact ground control for taxi clearance. Kennedy Ground, Prestige 909, ready to taxi, runway 31 left. There was a pause. Usually, the response was immediate. Kennedy Ground, Prestige 909, Sullivan repeated, irritation creeping in. Static crackled. Then a voice from the tower cut through. It wasn't the usual casual, rhythmic cadence of the air traffic controller. It was the supervisor. The tone was grave, urgent, and loud. Prestige 909, hold position. Do not start engines. I repeat, hold position immediately. Sullivan frowned. Tower, we are pushed back and clear. What's the holdup? Prestige 909. We have received a repo order regarding your aircraft, registration N779PA. The owner of the aircraft has revoked the certificate of airworthiness, effective immediately. You are grounded." Sullivan laughed. He actually laughed. "Tower, check your notes. Prestige owns this plane. We don't have an owner." "Negative. 909. Registry shows the aircraft is leased from Vance Capital Holdings. We just received a Level 1 asset seizure notification from their legal counsel. If you start those engines, you are committing a felony. Shut it down." Sullivan felt a cold drop of sweat slide down his spine. Vance Capital. The name triggered a memory, a magazine cover he'd seen in the airport lounge a month ago. The Sharks of Wall Street. There was a face on the cover, a young face, dark skin, intense eyes. Sullivan's head snapped toward the window. He looked at the jet bridge they had just left. Through the rain and the fogged glass of the terminal, he couldn't see the man in the hoodie anymore, but he could feel him. "Dave," Sullivan whispered, his voice trembling. "Get the manifest. The passenger we just kicked off. What was his name?" David scrambled for the iPad. He scrolled down to 1A. Vance. Julian Vance. The color drained from Sullivan's face so fast it looked like he'd been embalmed. "Oh my God," Sullivan breathed. Suddenly, the cockpit screens flickered. The flight management system, FMS, went black. Then the main power bus cut out. The aircraft plunged into darkness, save for the emergency battery-operated floor lights. "What the hell?" David yelled. "They killed the remote link," Sullivan said, his hands shaking as he gripped the useless yoke. "They just bricked the plane from the ground." In the first-class cabin, the screams began. The lights had gone out just as Felicity Vanderwoodson was raising a glass of Dom Perignon to her lips. The sudden darkness made her spill the champagne all over her Chanel blouse. "What is happening?" she shrieked. "Captain, I demand lights!" But there were no lights. The air conditioning hum died, replaced by a suffocating silence. The plane was a 300-ton metal coffin sitting on a rainy tarmac. Back on the jet bridge, Julian Vance lowered his satellite phone. He looked at Officer Miller, who was staring at the dark silhouette of the plane. "The engines didn't start," Miller muttered. He looked at Julian with a new kind of fear. "What did you do?" "I told you," Julian said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I repossessed my property. Now, if you're done detaining the owner of the aircraft for trespassing on his own plane, I'd like to leave." Miller's radio crackled. It was the airport police dispatch. Unit 4, come in. We have a code red situation. The police chief is coming down. We just got a call from the mayor's office. Do you have a Mr. Julian Vance in custody?" Miller swallowed hard. He looked at his partner. He looked at Julian. Unit 4, affirmative. "Release him immediately," the dispatcher screamed, her voice distorting over the radio. "Do not, I repeat, do not process him. Offer him an escort to the VIP lounge. The airline CEO is on the phone with the chief. They are freaking out." Julian adjusted his hoodie. He stepped closer to Miller, who involuntarily took a step back. "I don't need the lounge," Julian said. "I'm going to the Ritz. You can tell the airline CEO I'll see him at the shareholder meeting on Monday. I imagine he'll have a lot of explaining to do." Julian turned and walked away. He didn't run. He didn't look back. He walked with the rhythmic, terrifying confidence of a man who had just burned an empire to the ground without striking a match. By the time Julian reached the curbside pickup at JFK, the video was already at 3 million views. The teenager in seat 2B, a kid named Leo, had uploaded it to TikTok with the caption, "Prestige Airways drags black billionaire off plane B. C.A. Karen wanted his seat. Then the plane shut down. The comma is bought number Prestige, number Woe, number Julian Vance. The algorithm devoured it. The footage was shaky but damning. It showed Julian's calm refusal. It showed Felicity's screeching entitlement. It showed Captain Sullivan's arrogance. It showed the brutality of the police. But the kicker was the second video. Uploaded 10 minutes later, it showed the plane sitting dark on the tarmac, surrounded by emergency vehicles, with the caption, "He owns the plane. He turned it off." The internet exploded. Twitter, now X, was a war zone. Number boycott Prestige was trending #1 worldwide within 30 minutes. Is he a crypto king? Did Julian Vance just remotely brick a Boeing 777? That is the biggest power move in history. Silent social justice warrior. The way they treated him is disgusting. Prestige Airways needs to die. Wall Street bets. Vance Capital just recalled the debt. Puts on Prestige. This stock is going to zero by open. Inside the Prestige Airways Operations Center in Dallas, panic was not a strong enough word. It was a massacre. Marcus Thorne, the CEO of Prestige Airways, was in his pajamas, staring at a massive monitor wall that looked like a bloodbath. Every single flight over the Atlantic had been flagged, cancelled, or grounded. "What do you mean we can't fly?" Thorne screamed into his phone. "We have contracts, sir." His general counsel stammered on the other end. "The contracts have a conduct clause. Vance Capital is arguing that by assaulting their CEO, we violated the terms of the lease. They have declared us in default. They have frozen the assets. Every plane we lease from them, which is 60% of our fleet, is legally stolen property if we move it." "Get Vance on the phone," Thorne roared. "Offer him anything. Free flights for life, a seat on the board. Just get the planes in the air." "We tried, sir." His assistant, Alistair, took the call. He said, "Mr. Vance is currently resting and doesn't negotiate with," I believe the phrase was, "budget-tier bigots." Thorne threw his phone against the wall. It shattered. Back at JFK, the scene inside Flight 909 was deteriorating. The auxiliary power unit had failed. The toilets had stopped flushing. The air was getting hot and stale. Because the plane was technically repossessed, the airport ground crew, who were unionized and had seen the video, were refusing to tow it back to the gate until the legal ownership was resolved. For 4 hours, Felicity Vander Woodson sat in the dark. Her phone battery was dead. Her champagne was sticky on her blouse. The passengers around her weren't whispering anymore. They were openly hostile. "This is your fault," the man in 1F said, leaning across the aisle. "You just had to have that seat." "I am a victim here," Felicity cried, though her voice lacked its usual punch. "Lady," the man said, "you aren't a victim. Hope you like staying home, because nobody is ever going to invite you anywhere again." Finally, the door opened. It wasn't the flight crew. It was a lawyer from Vance Capital, flanked by federal agents. "Ladies and gentlemen," the lawyer announced, his voice booming through a megaphone into the dark cabin. "My name is Arthur Pendleton, representing the owner of this aircraft. We are authorizing your deplaning now. However, this aircraft is now a crime scene regarding the assault of Julian Vance. All crew members, please remain seated. Federal authorities are here to take your statements." Captain Sullivan, sitting in the dark cockpit, put his head in his hands. He thought about his pension. He thought about his boat. He thought about the look in Julian's eyes. He knew it was over. Monday morning in Dallas didn't break with the sun. It broke with the sound of ringing telephones that no one wanted to answer. The headquarters of Prestige Airways, a monolith of glass and steel that usually projected invincibility, now felt like a bunker under siege. The lobby was a chaotic sea of reporters, cameramen, and angry shareholders. Security had locked down the elevators, but the panic had already ascended to the 50th floor. Inside the executive boardroom, the silence was heavy, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning and the rhythmic tapping of the CFO's pen against the mahogany table. Marcus Thorne, the CEO who had been profiled in Forbes Times just last month as an aviation visionary, looked like a man who hadn't slept in 72 hours. His tie was loosened, his eyes were bloodshot, and his hands were trembling slightly as he stared at the massive monitors on the wall. The stock ticker was a relentless red line plunging downward. PSG, $4.12, down 91%. "It's a bloodbath," whispered Leonard Sterling, the chairman of the board. Sterling was 70 years old, a man of old oil money who viewed the world as something to be bought. "Marcus, stop staring at the screen. Fix it. Call him again." "I have called him 12 times, Leonard," Thorne snapped, his voice cracking. He doesn't answer. His assistant, Alistair, just plays classical music and hangs up. "We have to get the fleet in the air," the CFO, a woman named Karen Mills, said, her voice rising in hysteria. "We missed the morning bank drop. Fuel suppliers are demanding cash on delivery. If those 777s don't fly by noon, we are technically insolvent. We won't make payroll on Friday." "We are not going insolvent," Sterling slammed his hand on the table. "We are Prestige Airways. We are an institution. This is just a misunderstanding, a PR hiccup. We offer the boy some money. We fire the pilot, and we move on." "The boy?" Thorne let out a dry, mirthless laugh. "Leonard, that boy owns our debt. That boy has effectively placed a boot on the neck of this entire company. He isn't looking for a settlement. He's looking for a funeral." Suddenly, the double doors at the far end of the room groaned. The room froze. The private security detail stationed outside had been given strict orders. No one enters. But the doors swung open with a slow, deliberate weight. Julian Vance walked in. He wasn't wearing the hoodie today. The streetwear disruptor from the viral video was gone. In his place was the apex predator of Wall Street. Julian wore a bespoke navy suit cut by a master tailor on Savile Row, the fabric absorbing the light. He wore no tie, the top button of his crisp white shirt open, projecting an air of casual, terrifying dominance. Flanking him were 3 people. To his left, Alistair, holding a tablet. To his right, 2 lawyers who looked like they billed by the nanosecond. "Security!" Sterling shouted, standing up. "Remove these intruders!" The head of security, a burly man named Dave, stepped into the doorway. He looked at Sterling. Then he looked at Julian. "Mr. Vance signed my paycheck this morning, sir," Dave said quietly. "Technically, he's the one who signs the security contracts now. I work for him." Dave stepped back and closed the doors. The silence that followed was suffocating. Julian didn't speak. He walked the length of the long mahogany table, the sound of his Italian leather shoes echoing on the floor. He stopped at the head of the table, directly opposite Marcus Thorne. Julian placed a single, thin leather folder on the table. "Gentlemen, ladies," Julian said. His voice was calm, deep, and devoid of any anger. It was the voice of a man discussing the weather. "I trust you had a restful weekend. I know I didn't. I was busy." "Mr. Vance," Thorne began, standing up to try and meet Julian's eye level. He smoothed his suit jacket, trying to regain some shred of authority. "Look, things got out of hand. We admit that. Captain Sullivan went rogue. We are prepared to make this right. We've drafted a settlement offer." Thorne slid a paper across the table. $10 million, a public apology, and a seat on our Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Board. It's generous, Julian. Take it, and let's get the planes flying. Julian looked at the paper. He didn't pick it up. He smiled, a cold, razor-sharp expression that didn't reach his eyes. $10 million? Julian asked softly. "Marcus, I spent $15 million this morning before I finished my coffee." The board members exchanged confused glances. "You think this is about money?" Julian continued, pacing slowly behind the empty chairs. "You think you can write a check and make the humiliation go away? You think you can buy back my dignity?" He stopped behind Leonard Sterling's chair. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But you can't buy what you've already sold. Julian signaled to Alistair. The screen on the wall changed. The stock ticker disappeared, replaced by a complex spiderweb diagram of corporate ownership. Let me explain your current position, since you seem to be struggling with the math, Julian said, walking back to the head of the table. When you leased your Boeing 777 fleet, you signed a contract with Vance Capital. That contract contained a reputational hazard clause. It allows the lessor to recall the debt immediately if the lessee engages in conduct that damages the asset's value. That's a standard boilerplate clause, the CFO argued. It's never enforced. It is today, Julian countered. I've declared you in default. That triggers a cross-default on your bonds, which means, as of 9 a.m. this morning, your entire $2 billion debt load is due. Immediately. We can file for Chapter 11, Sterling shouted. We'll get an injunction. A judge will stop you. You could, Julian nodded. But Chapter 11 protects the company from creditors. It doesn't protect the board from shareholder lawsuits. Julian tapped the leather folder he had placed on the table. This morning, my firm acquired 51% of the Class A voting shares through a series of shell companies. I am now your majority shareholder, and as the majority shareholder, if you file for bankruptcy to avoid paying me, I will sue each of you personally for fiduciary negligence. The color drained from the room. Fiduciary negligence meant their personal assets were on the table, their Hamptons houses, their yachts, their private portfolios. You're bluffing, Sterling wheezed, clutching his chest. You can't pierce the corporate veil like that. Try me, Julian said. His voice hardened, losing its casual edge. You dragged me off that plane like a criminal. You let your captain sneer at me. You let your staff treat me like garbage because I didn't fit your image of wealth. You wanted a war. You have one, and I have more ammunition than you have time. He opened the leather folder. Inside was a single document. This is a surrender of control agreement, Julian announced. It states that the current board of directors resigns, effective immediately. It grants full operational control to Vance Capital. It waives your golden parachutes. You leave with nothing but your pensions, which, frankly, I was tempted to take too. But I'm feeling generous. And if we don't sign? Thorne asked, his voice barely a whisper. If you don't sign. Julian leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. I keep the fleet grounded. The stock goes to zero by market close. The company liquidates. 15,000 employees lose their jobs. And I make sure the press knows exactly who to blame. I will spend the next 10 years in court hunting down every dime you have stashed in the Caymans. I will ruin you, Marcus. Not because of business, but because you need to learn that you cannot treat people like cattle. The room fell into a deathly silence. The air conditioning seemed to roar. Thorne looked at the document. He looked at his board members. Sterling was pale, staring at the table. The CFO was crying silently. They were trapped. They were old money, slow and arrogant, and they had just been outmaneuvered by a man who played by a set of rules they hadn't bothered to learn. You planned this, Thorne whispered, looking up at Julian with a mix of hatred and awe. You didn't just react. You had this ready. I always have a plan for hostile entities, Julian replied. Whether it's a rival tech firm or a racist airline, the strategy is the same. Control the leverage. Control the outcome. Thorne picked up the heavy fountain pen. His hand shook violently. He looked at the signature line. Marcus Thorne, CEO, resignation. He signed. The scratch of the pen sounded like a scream. He slid the folder to Sterling. The old man hesitated, his pride battling his self-preservation. He looked at Julian, who simply checked his watch, that platinum Patek Philippe, and raised an eyebrow. Sterling signed, one by one. The folder moved around the table. The boardroom massacre was silent, bloodless, and total. When the folder returned to Julian, he checked the signatures. He nodded to Alistair. "Execute the liquidity injection," Julian ordered. "Get the ground crews back to work. Tell the tower the hold is lifted. Flight 909 flies today." "Yes, sir," Alistair said, tapping his tablet. "And Marcus," Julian said as the defeated CEO began to pack his briefcase. Thorne paused. "Yes?" "Leave the briefcase," Julian said coldly. "Company property. Security will escort you out. You can mail us your badge." Thorne froze. He looked at the briefcase, then at Julian. He dropped it on the chair. "You're a monster," Thorne spat. "No," Julian corrected him, buttoning his suit jacket. "I'm the CEO, and you're trespassing." Julian turned to the window, looking out over the Dallas skyline. Behind him, the sound of shuffling feet marked the end of an era. "Alistair," Julian said, watching the former masters of the universe being led out by the security guards. "Sir, get the marketing team up here. I hate the color gold. We're repainting the fleet." "What color, sir?" "Blue," Julian said, watching a plane take off in the distance. "Dark, deep blue. And change the name. Prestige implies exclusion. We need something that implies balance." "Fairway Airlines," Alistair suggested. Julian smiled. It was the first genuine smile he had worn in days. "Fairway," Julian repeated. "Perfect. Now get me a coffee and book me a seat on the next flight to London. Economy class." "Economy, sir." "Yes," Julian said, sitting in the CEO's chair and spinning it around to face the desk. "I need to check the legroom. We're going to be making some changes." The takeover of Prestige Airways was not a gentle transition. It was a corporate exorcism. In the 48 hours following the boardroom surrender, the atmosphere inside the Dallas headquarters shifted from panic to a terrifyingly quiet efficiency. Julian Vance didn't bring in a wrecking ball. He brought in a scalpel. He set up a temporary command center in the CEO's office, which he had stripped of its opulent Persian rugs and mahogany humidors, and began the systematic dismantling of the old guard. The first thing to go was the name. Crews were seen on the tarmac at JFK, Heathrow, and LAX, scraping the gold leaf Prestige lettering off the fuselages. The new branding was simple, clean, and understated. Fairway Airlines. The logo was a stylized scale, representing balance and equity. But paint is cheap. Culture is expensive, and the price for the culture of arrogance that had festered at Prestige was about to be paid by the individuals who had enforced it. The fall of the captain, Rick Sully Sullivan, sat in a sterile, fluorescent-lit hearing room at the Federal Aviation Administration's regional office in Fort Worth. He wasn't wearing his captain's uniform. He was wearing a suit that suddenly felt too tight around the collar. Across the table sat a 3-person review board. In the center was Director Holloway, a woman with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen every excuse in the book. "Mr. Sullivan," Holloway said, looking over her spectacles at a file that was 3 inches thick, "we have reviewed the cockpit voice recordings, the passenger video evidence, and the sworn statements from the ground crew. You initiated a confrontation with a compliant passenger. You escalated a non-threat situation. And most damning of all, you attempted to operate an aircraft that had been legally grounded by its lessor, fully aware of the warning from the tower. I was following company protocol regarding unruly passengers," Sullivan stammered, his voice lacking the boom it had in the cockpit. "The passenger was. He was aggressive. We have the video, Mr. Sullivan," Holloway cut in, her voice sharp. Mr. Vance was sitting down. He was speaking in a normal register. "The only aggression came from you. You weaponized your authority to discriminate against a passenger based on bias." She closed the file. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the small room. "The board has reached a decision. Your airline transport pilot certificate is hereby revoked, permanently. You are grounded, Mr. Sullivan. You will not fly a commercial aircraft in the United States again." "Revoked?" Sullivan stood up, his face flushing purple. "You can't do that. I have 30 years of experience. I'm a senior captain. You times were times a senior captain, Holloway corrected. Now you are a liability. Good day. The professional death was swift, but the financial ruin was a slow bleed. 2 weeks later, Sullivan received a letter from the legal department of Fairway Airlines. It was signed by Arthur Pendleton, Julian's shark of a lawyer. The letter informed Sullivan that due to his termination for gross misconduct and public endangerment, his pension, accumulated over 20 years, was void. The contract he had signed years ago had a morality clause, one that the airline had never enforced until now. Sullivan tried to sue. He went to 3 different labor attorneys. The first 2 laughed him out of the office once they heard who he was up against. The third, a strip mall lawyer named Saul, took the case for a $5,000 retainer. Julian's legal team buried Saul in so much paperwork motions, countersuits for brand defamation, and discovery requests that Sullivan ran out of money before they even reached a deposition. 6 months later, the man who used to command a $300 million aircraft and look down on the world from 35,000 feet was working the night shift at an Amazon logistics warehouse in Newark. It was 3:04 a.m. on a Tuesday. Sullivan was wearing a neon safety vest, holding a clipboard, yelling at a forklift driver to move faster. "Hey, Sully," a younger worker called out during a break. He was holding up his phone. "You see this? That new airline, Fairway? They just announced record profits. They're giving every employee a 10% bonus." Sullivan stared at the phone screen. He saw Julian Vance's face on the news, smiling, shaking hands with a pilot. "Whatever," Sullivan muttered, turning away to hide the bitterness in his eyes. "Get back to work." "Wait a second," the kid said, zooming in on the phone, then looking at Sullivan. "You look just like that guy. That pilot who got fired. The one in the video." Sullivan froze. He felt the heat rising in his neck. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yeah, you are," the kid laughed. "You're the get off my plane guy." "Damn, Sully. You went from first class to loading pallets." Sullivan didn't answer. He walked into the break room, locked the door, and sat in the dark, listening to the hum of the vending machine, realizing that the altitude of his life was now 0. The exile of the socialite. If Sullivan lost his livelihood, Felicity Vander Woodson lost her existence. High society in New York is a small, vicious ecosystem. It survives on reputation, and Felicity had become radioactive. The video of her screeching, "I don't want him next to me," had been remixed into a dance track that was currently charting on Spotify. She couldn't walk down Fifth Avenue without someone pulling out a phone to film her. But the real blow came from her husband, Preston. Preston Vander Woodson was an investment banker whose firm managed assets for very diverse, very wealthy clients. When the video went viral, 3 of his biggest pension fund clients threatened to pull their money if he didn't distance himself from the PR disaster. The divorce meeting took place in a glass-walled conference room in Manhattan. Felicity arrived wearing oversized sunglasses and a scarf, trying to hide. "I want the Hamptons house," Felicity told her lawyer, "and half the portfolio. I am the victim here, Preston. That man ruined my life." Preston didn't look at her. He looked at the table. His lawyer, a cold woman named Beatrice, slid a document across the polished surface. "Felicity," Beatrice said calmly, "are you familiar with the social grace clause in your prenuptial agreement?" "The what?" Clause 14b. It states that if either party engages in public conduct that brings irreparable reputational harm to the family name or business interests, the asset division is capped at a base stipend. "Reputational harm?" Felicity shrieked. "I was defending my seat." "You were displaying racism on a global stage," Beatrice said. "Preston has lost 4 major accounts this week because of you. We are invoking the clause. You get the apartment in the city, which you will likely have to sell to pay your legal fees, and a monthly allowance of $5,000 for 3 years. That is it." $5,000? Felicity gasped. That doesn't even cover my driver. Then I suggest you learn to use Uber, Preston finally spoke, standing up and buttoning his jacket. And, by the way, don't try to fly to Paris for Fashion Week to cool off. Why? She snapped. Because I checked. You're on the exclusion list. Julian Vance shared his security data with the Sky Team and Star Alliance networks. They flagged you as a high-risk disruptor. You're grounded, Felicity. Indefinitely. Felicity watched him walk out. She sat alone in the conference room, the silence deafening. She reached for her phone to call her best friend, Bitsy. The call went straight to voicemail. Then she tried her sister. Voicemail. She looked at her contacts list. Dozens of names. Not one of them would answer. She wasn't just divorced. She was deleted. The redemption of the bystander. Sarah, the flight attendant who had stood by and let it happen, expected to be fired. In fact, she had already packed her bags. She was summoned to the Dallas HQ 3 weeks after the takeover. She sat in the waiting room, her hands trembling. When the door opened, it wasn't a lawyer who called her in. It was Julian Vance. He was sitting on the edge of a desk, reading a report. He looked up. Sit down, Sarah. She sat. Mr. Vance, I want to apologize. I should have. You should have stopped it, Julian finished for her. You should have backed the passenger who was in the right, not the one who had the platinum card. You let fear of authority override your moral compass. I know, she whispered. Captain Sullivan. He was intimidating. The culture here. It was always, the customer with the most miles is God. I know, Julian said. That's why I fired the entire executive training staff this morning. Sarah looked up, surprised. I've reviewed your file, Sarah, Julian said, picking up a folder. 15 years. Perfect attendance. Hundreds of commendations for safety. You're a good flight attendant who worked in a bad system. I don't believe in waste, and firing you would be a waste of experience. So, I can keep my job? No, Julian said. Sarah's heart sank. You're not going to be a flight attendant anymore, Julian continued. I'm creating a new department, guest equity and conflict resolution. I want you to run the training program. I want you to teach new hires exactly what went wrong on Flight 909. I want you to tell them how it felt to stand there and do nothing. Can you do that? Sarah stared at him, tears welling in her eyes. It wasn't just a job offer. It was a chance to fix the guilt that had been eating her alive. Yes, she said, her voice shaking. Yes, I can. Good, Julian said. Your salary is doubled. Get to work. The victory lap. 1 year later, the rebranding was complete. Fairway Airlines was the darling of Wall Street and the traveling public. The stock price had tripled. The new cabins, where Royal Class was replaced by Business First and economy had an extra 3 inches of legroom, were winning awards. But the true test was always on the ground. Julian Vance was traveling to London for the 1-year anniversary of the takeover. He didn't take a private jet. He flew commercial on his own airline. Fairway Flight 909 from JFK. He walked into the terminal wearing a blazer and jeans, carrying his own bag. As he approached the gate, he saw a commotion. A man in a sharp suit was yelling at a gate agent. This is unacceptable. I am a global elite member. My bag is 2 pounds over, and you want to charge me? Do you know how much I spend with this airline? The gate agent was a young woman, barely 25. She didn't flinch. She didn't look scared. She pointed to a small framed placard on the counter. It was the new company motto, dignity at every altitude. Sir, the agent said, her voice calm but firm, we value your business, but we value our rules and our staff's well-being more. You can either check the bag and pay the fee, or you can leave it here. But if you raise your voice at me one more time, I will deny you boarding. We don't do bullying here. Not anymore. The businessman paused. He looked around. He saw other passengers watching, not with fear, but with approval. He saw that the power dynamic had shifted. The card in his wallet didn't give him the right to be a tyrant. "Fine," the man grumbled. He pulled out his credit card. "Charge it." Julian watched from the back of the line. A small smile played on his lips. He boarded the plane and turned left, heading for seat 1A. As he settled in, a flight attendant approached. It wasn't Sarah. She was back in Dallas running the training center. It was a young man named David. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Vance," David said. "Can I get you anything before takeoff? Sparkling water would be great." "Thanks," Julian said. "And sir?" David paused. "I just wanted to say thank you for saving our jobs and for making this a place we're proud to work." Julian nodded. "We're just getting started." As the plane pushed back from the gate, the rain began to streak the windows of JFK, just as it had 1 year ago. But this time, the lights stayed on. The engines hummed to life with a powerful, steady roar. Julian put on his headphones. He didn't look back at the terminal. He looked forward, at the runway lights stretching out into the dark, guiding them toward the sky. He had been dragged off a plane in handcuffs, humiliated and bruised, but he had returned to buy the sky. He closed his eyes as the wheels lifted off the tarmac. The debt was paid, the balance was restored, and as the Boeing 777 climbed through the clouds, piercing the storm to find the smooth air above, Julian Vance finally got the one thing he had wanted that night: a quiet flight, in his own seat, with absolutely no one to tell him he didn't belong.